Somewhere in a limestone cave in southern England, about 15,000 years ago, someone picked up a human skull, and instead of burying it, they turned it into a cup. Not a metaphor, not a myth, an actual drinking vessel, carefully shaped, the edges smoothed down with what looks like deliberate craftsmanship. There were human ribs with cut marks identical to the cut marks found on deer bones nearby. Teeth marks, human teeth marks on human fingers. For a long time, archaeologists didn't want to say the obvious word out loud. The evidence kept piling up, cave after cave, continent after continent. Was it always about survival? Was it always a last resort? Or is that the comfortable story we tell ourselves because the alternative is harder to sit with? Some of it was survival. Some of it was ritual. Some of it was grief. And some of it, disturbingly, might not have been about hunger at all. Part 1. Before we go any further, we need to talk about how archaeologists actually know this happened. The evidence for ancient cannibalism is written directly onto the bones themselves. Cut marks in specific locations. Percussion marks. Pot polish. Actual human tooth marks embedded directly into human bone. When archaeologists find just one of these signs, it's interesting but not conclusive. There's really only one honest conclusion left standing. This pattern hasn't shown up once. It's shown up dozens of times, across continents, across different species of ancient humans, and across a staggering span of time. Part 2. In northern Spain, there's a cave system called Gran Dolina. Deep inside one of its layers, dated to roughly 800,000 years ago, researchers found the remains of a species called Homo antecessor. Those remains were covered in cut marks. These human remains were found mixed in with the remains of other animals, deer, bison, that had clearly been hunted and butchered using identical techniques. Researchers who studied this site proposed something they called nutritional cannibalism, treating other humans as just another available source of calories. In that kind of world, when two competing groups ran into each other over the same hunting grounds, the losers of that encounter may not have simply been driven away. This is one of the oldest, clearest examples we have. Cannibalism, at its earliest known point, appears deeply tangled up with two things at once: survival and violence between competing groups. Part 3. Now let's talk about Neanderthals. In southeastern France, at a site called Moulagursi, researchers uncovered Neanderthal remains dating back around 100,000 years. Cut marks concentrated exactly where you'd expect if muscle were being stripped from bone. Multiple individuals were represented, including children. At El Sidrón in Spain, researchers found the remains of at least a dozen individuals showing very similar evidence. This may have been an entire family group or extended kin unit. Some argue this evidence points squarely toward survival cannibalism. Small, isolated Neanderthal groups living in a harsh Ice Age environment. Others point to something called endocannibalism, a way of honoring the dead by literally incorporating them into the bodies of the living. Some anthropologists argue that for certain ancient groups, eating the dead wasn't a horror to be forced into. It was a form of respect. The story of ancient cannibalism isn't one simple story. It's several different stories, layered on top of each other. Part 4. Ice Age Europe was not a forgiving place. Large game migrated elsewhere or died off in large numbers. Small human groups, often numbering only a few dozen individuals, found themselves genuinely isolated, with no neighboring group nearby to trade with. Bones from the same time layer showing signs of malnutrition. Things that would never normally be considered food, being eaten anyway, because there was simply nothing else. There's something almost unbearably sad about this specific category of evidence. Reaching the absolute end of every other option. There is no clear evidence that anyone was killed specifically to be eaten. Someone within the group had already died. From starvation, from illness. Multiple well-documented cases exist of groups trapped by extreme circumstances. Stranded travelers, shipwrecked sailors, snowbound expeditions. Survivors overwhelmingly describe the decision as the single most traumatic act of their entire lives, something many carried as a profound psychological burden for decades afterward. Part 5. Now let's flip to the other end of the spectrum, because not every case of ancient cannibalism lines up with starvation evidence. Anthropologists studying more recent cultures around the world have identified something called mortuary cannibalism, or endocannibalism, practiced not out of hunger, but as an intentional part of funeral practices. One of the most well-documented examples of this comes from a group in Papua New Guinea called the Fore people, believing it allowed the person's life force to continue within the community. This practice was carried out with deep reverence, following specific customs, and was understood by the community itself not as horror, but as love, grief, and continuity. This particular practice also became directly connected to a devastating and mysterious illness that spread specifically through this specific ritual. A fatal neurological disease. It demonstrates how deeply meaningful, nonviolent, and lovingly intentioned this practice was for the people involved. When archaeologists find human bones showing cut marks and cooking evidence, but the surrounding site shows no signs of starvation, no signs of violent conflict, it opens up the very real possibility that some ancient cannibalism wasn't a horror story at all. It may have been an ancient version of exactly what the Fore people practiced: a funeral. Our modern instinct is to immediately assume the most horrifying possible explanation. Plenty of human behaviors that look monstrous through a modern lens were, within their own original cultural context, deeply meaningful. Part 6. There's a third category that researchers have identified: cannibalism used deliberately as an act of warfare, domination, or terror against rival groups. Skull fractures consistent with weapon strikes, defensive wounds, evidence of a settlement being violently overrun. Consuming the bodies of defeated enemies wasn't about nutrition at all. It was about total domination. Consuming an enemy, whether symbolically or literally, was understood as a way of absorbing their strength, their courage, or their power. Ancient cannibalism wasn't one behavior with one motive. It was likely several distinct behaviors, sometimes overlapping within the very same ancient community. Part 7. Let's circle back to where we began, that cave in England, and that skull carefully shaped into a cup. This site, one of the most extensively studied prehistoric cannibalism sites in the world, dates back roughly 15,000 years. On one hand, there's clear evidence of nutritional cannibalism. Exactly the kind of evidence you'd expect from a group under severe food stress. But then there are the skull cups. Multiple skulls at this site show an extraordinary level of careful, deliberate craftsmanship. The kind of care you'd expect to be put into crafting a genuinely valued object, not the rushed, functional damage of desperate emergency butchery. It seems to blend multiple categories at once. Something shifted, and the remains stopped being treated purely as food and started being treated as material for meaningful, crafted objects. Ancient humans were cannibals is true, but it barely scratches the surface of what that single sentence is actually hiding. Part 8. So why does any of this actually matter? It forces us to confront something uncomfortable about the flexibility of human morality under extreme pressure. We like to believe that certain moral lines are absolute. Under conditions of extreme, sustained, no-alternative desperation, that line has moved. They weren't mindless savages acting purely on primal instinct. They were making complex, layered decisions, shaped by grief, by desperation, by social structure. This behavior appears repeatedly across different species of ancient humans, across wildly different time periods, across entirely different continents. Part 9. Bones can tell researchers an extraordinary amount. But bones cannot tell us what someone was feeling. Researchers studying the exact same set of bones can, and often do, arrive at different conclusions about the underlying motive. Closing. So, did ancient humans practice cannibalism for survival? The honest answer is yes, absolutely, in numerous well-documented cases. Survival cannibalism sits alongside ritual mourning cannibalism, sits alongside cannibalism used as an act of warfare and domination, layered on top of each other. Maybe the real lesson here isn't about how disturbing our ancestors' choices were. Maybe it's about how much we still don't understand about the true limits and the true depths of human resilience, human grief, and human capacity.